You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Friday evening, folks. That's it. It's the end of the week. It seems like it gets tighter and tighter every week between Fridays. Maybe that's the age thing. Time goes by so much quicker. So it just seems like it was last Friday. But it's Friday. Welcome to it. Here's our end of the week show. And this is Scotty Roberts, of course. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. For all of those of you who have not visited there yet, you can go pick up the audio stream there, as well as find out all the places where this show broadcasts in audio form, and then check out the schedule. See all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And at the same time, if you're listening only audibly, you can come over to the YouTube channel and watch the simulcast in video. And one of the big features of this show over there on YouTube is the fact that you can join the live chat room with the other Intrepheads that are listening to this show. And that's over at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. All right, I want to show you guys one thing, and I didn't prep it for this. Darn it. I've got one little sale item that I want to show you. We sell all kinds of t-shirts, and we do all of that kind of stuff. We've been doing t-shirts and mugs for the other show I do with Rocky Stucci in the Situation Room. But I want to show you there is a mug that we have now, and you can find it over on my Etsy channel, or my Etsy page. And that is etsy.com/shop/son of a patriot. And I've got a mug in here somewhere, and I'm trying to find out where I put it, and I'm not seeing it for some reason. It's not in my file. It's not where I thought I had it. So, oh well, we'll skip it, because I'm not going to waste a valuable radio time trying. Oh, wait, hold on. Here it is. I'm going to import this in right now. It's just an image, all right? Now, this is the image that you can see that's going to be on the, and it's cut off here. It's going to be on, pardon my fumbling around. For those of you listening audibly, you aren't seeing any of this. So I know this is scintillating live radio. But there you go. There is the boldly going Intrepid coffee mug. It's got our rocket on there, emblazoned on there, our Buck Rogers style rocket. I designed that rocket 10, 11 years ago when we first started doing Intrepid magazine. And so this is the coffee mug. This is what's wrapped around a white 15-ounce ceramic coffee mug. You can go look at it over at etsy.com/shop/son of a patriot. And while you're there, you can look at all our other stuff. So there you go. There is my shameless plug for tonight for this show. I drink a lot of coffee. I don't have my own Intrepid mug yet. I've ordered one for myself so I can be drinking out of my own mug during the show. You can go get yourself one, too. Go take a look at it first, though. And so welcome to the show tonight. Tonight I want to do something a little different. We've been serious and all kinds of serious upon serious upon serious. And there's one thing I just want to mention before we get into tonight's show topic. And that is this whole thing about, I see it all over the social media. And folks, this is tying into exactly what we've been talking about all week with conspiracy theories and the like. How people choose to believe something and they will not change their mind even when presented with facts. So the whole thing about the president saying we should all now be shooting up with Lysol or bleach byproducts, that is not what he said. Let's clear it up. If somebody is trying to convince you, oh, look at this dumbass president, now he's telling us that we should inject ourselves with bleach or Lysol. That is not what the president said. Now, he may have expounded on that a little bit, but remember, he's doing daily briefings. And what he's presenting to the American public are all the different things that are on the table that they're looking at, that the scientific community and the medical community is looking at for ways to fight the virus. One such thing on his table was the possibility of trying to find ways that some of these chemicals can work in vaccines and ways to... I don't even know enough about it. But if I were president and I was presented this, I'd say, hey, look, here's one of the things that we're talking about. And it's possible UV light. Is there a way to get UV light into the infected areas internally? Is there a way to make, and they're working on doing something that's like, injecting yourself with something that disinfects. And so all of that stuff is stuff that's on the table. And daily he's saying stuff. And now everybody's camping on this. How irresponsible of the president. Somebody's going to go shoot up with Lysol. What a bunch of dumbasses would, first of all, promote that, is that that's what he actually said. And what other dumbass is going to try to inject himself with Lysol because he thinks it's going to affect a coronavirus? That's dumbass. Trump also said in all of that, he said, look, folks, you got to consult with your doctors about any kind of treatment you're following. This is just the stuff we're looking at. And he was speculating, is there something that can be made that's injectable, that's going to be like what is contained in these things that we know kill coronavirus on surfaces. So that's about as deep as it gets. So if you want to see a conspiracy theory, look to all your TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome, nincompoops, for lack of a better word I can use without swearing too deeply. You're going to listen to them, and they're all trying to prove what a bad person Trump is, how stupid he is, how dumb. He doesn't know anything. You know what? Their point is moot. And you can try to correct them in social media. Oh, no, this is what he was saying. Oh, now you're going to come out and tell us and try to defend what he said. And you know what? That is a prime example of a conspiracy theory where people want to look important because they've got the inside scoop. They know what they're talking about. And no matter what amount of information you can give them that helps explain what that is and what he actually was saying, they don't want to listen to that because they're convinced this is their thing now. And, impeachment didn't work. Maybe they can get him on this. So there you go. That's my 2 cents on politics and the coronavirus and all of that for today. Let's move away from that. Don't be duped. So now, tonight, I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. And if you've seen the graphic for tonight's show, then you'll know what it is already. But I want to talk about the Exodus, a biblical topic. We're not going to wax biblical and religious, however. But I think, for all the talk that I do about the theology of the Bible, I think the historicity of the Bible, the historical data that's contained, has many times over been proven to be, if not fairly accurate, outright accurate. And I wanted to look at the Exodus because I called up a great article from the Biblical Archaeological Society. Now, biblical, not in the sense that they are church-related. They're biblical in the sense that they take biblical topics and they talk about the archaeology in biblical areas, which is being done in the state of Israel. It's just being done by many different, and it has been going on for centuries. So, last 2 centuries especially. So this is what I want to dig into, the Exodus a little bit. I want to look at the roadmap that the Bible says the Israelites took out of Egypt. And we're going to compare it to historical records about the roadmaps and the cities that existed of the day. And so we're going to hit a couple of topics. Don't go, oh, groan, it's a history lesson. It's a fun history lesson. It has to do with shedding some light on something that is a big historical event, or an event that we, in religious circles, we celebrate, the Exodus from Egypt. And so the big question, when John and I wrote our book on the Exodus, and I was just looking to see if I had one right here. I don't. I've got them in a box down there, a few extra copies. But we wrote our book on the Exodus because we wanted to take a biblical topic and apply history to it and say, is there historical evidence that, first of all, were the Hebrew slaves really Hebrew slaves? Were the Israelites slaves in Egypt? Was there an exodus that took place? Who would the people have been that were surrounding this event? Now, if you watch the movies and the cartoons and all of that stuff, you see a lot of talk about Ramses II. Ramses the Great, as he was known, as being the pharaoh of the Exodus. But that date is far too late in history. It's 150 to 200 years too late from the events that took place, the probable dates of those events, especially when you start looking into historical record. And while there's no historical record that says here is the Exodus and how it happened, other than the pages of the writings of Moses himself, you have to look at other archaeological data and anthropological data and historical data to see if there is a matchup in some of these dates, to try to find out what really happened. That's what John and I did in our book, and this is kind of what I'm going to present to you tonight. I want to talk about the Exodus itinerary, and that is confirmed by Egyptian evidence. So the Exodus from Egypt, followed by the invasion and the conquest of Palestine under Moses, not descendant, the man he passed the power on to. Why am I blanking on the word for that? Which was Joshua, who took over leading Israel after the death of Moses, and he led them into Canaan, into, they say Palestine today in order to set the region in people's minds. Palestine didn't exist at the time. It was the land of Canaan that Israel went back to. And I'm going to bring that point up later, if we get to it and I remember it, about that difference between using the name Palestine or Canaan. Palestine didn't exist at the time. So it's Canaan. It's what's now Palestine. And this lies at the heart of the biblical account of Israel's origins. And so if you want to look at the biblical origin or the historical origin of Israel, it goes back into the Exodus. Now, a number of modern scholars reject the entire story as biblical myth, Jewish myth. And a number of modern scholars, while rejecting it, also reject most of the content of the Bible as being something that is efficacious on a historical level. Now, this is different than theology. You can take historical events and see that they were written about by biblical authors, but that doesn't necessarily mean the theology they wrap around those biblical events, those historical events, is the truth. It means they're using those historical events to present their theology. So this is why modern scholars can sometimes call it a myth altogether. But it is, in their view, this little more than a pious fabrication that was written hundreds of years after the events were described. The Scriptures, says Robert Coote, C-O-O-T-E, puts it succinctly, do not contain an accurate historical account of Israel's origin and early history. And in the words of another exponent of this school of thought, Thomas L. Thompson, thanks, Mom and Dad, for the original name, by the way. Hey, Thomas Thompson. Israel's own origin tradition is radically irrelevant to writing a history of Israel's origins. Now, this is how some modern scholars look at it. And now I want to examine 3 sites that are described in 3 different biblical passages, as well as some of the evidence that supposedly undermines the historical accuracy of the biblical account. The first is a city called Dibon, D-I-B-O-N. It's east of the Jordan River, or east of the Jordan River. And it's mentioned in the Bible in Numbers chapter 33, where the invading Israelites are said to have encamped at Dibon. And the excavation of Tel Dibon, it's the ruins, they call them a Tel, T-E-L or T-E-L-L. Tel something is the buried city. It's like Tel Sultan is the mound, the archaeological mound, the historical mound that's left of the city of Jericho, ancient Jericho. And it's right kind of inside the modern city of Jericho that built up around it. And so that Tel is there. So the excavation of Tel Dibon, ancient Dibon, and it's just spellings are different, has revealed no city there in the late Bronze Age. And the Bronze Age was about 1400 BCE to 1200 BCE. So that period of time, bronze, that's what they're making weapons out of. That's the metal they're using. They haven't advanced to steel yet. And so bronze. So when Exodus supposedly occurred was the late Bronze Age, and which puts it in that 1400 to 1200 BCE window. Now, I place the Exodus right around 1445 BCE. I wrote about that. And John, in our book, he places it about 80 years later. People who put forward the Ramses II ruled in about 1250 BC, so another 150 to 200 years out. So when the Exodus supposedly occurred, was between that window of time, or in that window of time. Now, there was nothing found at this place that they said was the site of Dibon, early in the 9th century BCE. So how could the Israelites encamp and presumably conquer a city that didn't exist? So this is the argument against that city, Dibon. The second site is Hebron, Hebron. According to the Bible, Moses sent spies to reconnoiter Hebron in preparation for the Israelite invasion. And it says in the Bible account in Numbers 13, it says they went up into the Negev and they came back, and they came to Hebron, the town. So when the invasion came, Hebron was a principal target. In the book of Joshua you find it, and in Judges you find it. So again, the skeptics call on archaeologists to support that case. But there was no city at Hebron, as it exists today, in the late Bronze Age. The third site is Kishon, Q-I-S-H-O-N, which figures in the accounts of Deborah's war against the Canaanite alliance led by Jabin, the king of Hatzor. And that's you find in Judges. And Deborah was one of the judges of Israel, Deborah. And here we find a significant agreement between the Bible and real history, is the location of that city. Now, the book of Numbers, chapter 33, is a really dry, matter-of-fact listing of the sites on the route of the Exodus. And the latter part of the chapter describes the Israelite invasion of Transjordan, which is, Jordan exists today. It's to the east of the Jordan River. The west of the Jordan River is what is now Israel. And so in the Transjordan. And that was a prelude to the conquest of all of the land of Canaan when they entered into what is now Transjordan. And the account sounds credible enough. It's even authoritative, as if based on real and reliable sources. When you read that biblical account, it sounds like they're looking at a road map. Well, over here in Hebron, in the Transjordan, and so the account sounds credible. And it certainly creates in the mind of even the most critical reader the impression of historical fact to the Exodus account. After all, the historian is absolute and specific. He describes the Transjordanian route the invaders took in quite remarkable detail, station by station, from the Arabah, that's the desolate region south of the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea as it's referred to to the plains of Moab, which is the lower Jordan Valley. And that's Eyam and Dibon and Almon Dibalthaim and Nebo and Abam Shittim, and finally the Jordan River. These are the routes they took, or the cities, the places they encountered along the way. And that's in Numbers chapter 33 in the Old Testament. On the face of it, the passage is a really impressive, credible piece of ancient historical writing. Traditional biblical scholars always regarded it as such. And for them, the account's extraordinary specificity, and precision of detail strongly indicate that the ancient historian who wrote this account had sources that accurately preserved the memory of a road used in very early times, not inconceivably in the late Bronze Age. So present-day detractors of these traditional scholars often portray them as unsophisticated, naive, or simply ideological paraphrasers of the Bible. And in fact, they were anything but that. They were just given to the intellectual conviction that a nation's own historical literature is, in the words of the eminent contemporary classical historian and historiographer Arnaldo I'm going to pronounce his name. I had it down. Momigliano. He's Italian. Hey, bring it in, eh? And by all principles, he says, by all principles of historical research and criteria of common sense, the most important source of knowledge for the history of that nation is the writings in the Old Testament. So Thompson, on the other hand, remember Tommy Thompson? Essentially ignores the early history of the Israelite people, written by the Israelites themselves. And in his massive volume on the subject entitled Early History of the Israelite People from the Written and Archaeological Sources, I put out in 1992, he just ignores the fact that Israel could possibly write about its own history. So according to Gösta Ahlström, who was, until his recent death, he was also a member of the rejectionist school, he said it's quite clear that the biblical writers knew nothing about events in Palestine, or Canaan, before the 10th century BCE. This is indicated, Ahlström said, by the plain fact that non-Israelite inscriptional material from the late Bronze Age contains not a shred of evidence confirming any event or the existence of any person mentioned in the biblical account of Israel's origins. Indeed, the biblical story doesn't even reflect any real knowledge of the geography of Palestine in the late Bronze Age, he contends. And so to support this thesis, Ahlström cites the invasion route of the Israelites in Numbers 33 is very specifically of detail in the narrative that an earlier generation perceived as evidence of its historicity. And for Ahlström, it's irrefutable evidence of the opposite. He wasn't the first to make this argument, but he strongly concurred, as did others of like conviction. So he's basically saying the evidence that it's so specific in Numbers 33, this roadmap, the names of these cities, states that they didn't, it's the opposite, that the biblical writers didn't know a damn thing about it, because it's too on the spot. And so we're going to leave on that for this first half, because we've got to go out to break. Let's pick that up when we come back, and let's talk about these cities and this roadmap and how the Israelites left Egypt and went to Canaan. All right, you sit tight. We're going to go out for some ads. We'll be right back. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can also catch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel right now. Join the live chat room with the other Intrepids at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. We're talking tonight about the Exodus and the route, specifically the route mentioned in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, one of the books of Moses, detailing the route they took to go from Egypt to Canaan. And, of course, without getting into the whole timeline of the 40 years in there. So we left off talking about how there is an argument that says because the route is so specific, naming specific cities, specific places, that it can't possibly be accurate in Numbers 33 because they would have known too much for the early Bronze Age. So among the Transjordanian cities where the invading Israelites encamped, in which they presumably besieged and attacked, was Dibon. This is the first city we mentioned of the three we're going to talk about. But this can't be, according to the rejectionists, for in actual fact, no late Bronze Age strata were found at the Tell of Dibon, and some remains from 1200 to 1100 were found on the summit of the Tell, but a city did not exist before the 9th century BCE. And we're talking about 13th century BC if you go back into the 1400s for the date of the Exodus. So 400 years later. And so it's true that excavations at Dibon, ancient Dibon, mainly in the 1950s, uncovered no late Bronze Age remains. An Israelite historical tradition is therefore, according to the rejectionists, wrong. Book of Numbers is wrong. But does the failure of a team of archaeologists to find a late Bronze Age stratum in the ruins of ancient Dibon lead to the conclusion that no city existed at the site between 1300 and 1200 BCE, even as early as 1400 BCE? If one holds to the biblical tradition, the archaeology of Dibon reveals only that in the late Bronze Age city, the city of Joshua, has not been yet found. So, lack of any late Bronze Age remains at Dibon is one of the linchpins. However, in the distinguished Palestinian archaeologist William Deaver's conclusion that there was no Israelite conquest of Canaan, this is where you find this rejectionist history. Now, did Dibon, this city, exist in the late Bronze Age? Does the road through the Transjordan, described in Numbers 33, reflect historical reality? In biblical studies, truth, quote unquote, is often the only matter of personal opinion, or a test of scholarly perceptions, or a momentary consensus. However, in the case of the claim of the biblical tradition that at the time of Joshua there was a Transjordanian route of Ayim Dibban Alman Diblathayim, Nebo, Abel, Jordan, the river, there's a witness who has not been called to testify, a witness who knows the truth. And that witness is Egypt. In the late Bronze Age, now let me explain this. In the late Bronze Age, Egypt ruled Palestine or Canaan, and in the course, it grates me that Palestine is used. Palestine is a political movement that started, and now the whole place is referred to as Palestine, the Middle East, and what is now Israel. It's not Palestine. It was not historically known as Palestine. It's Canaan. So Egypt ruled Palestine, what is now Palestine, and it was in the outskirts of the empire. And in the course of its 300-year jurisdiction, this is dynasties 18, 19, and much of my study has been in dynasty 18, where I place Moses, this guy over my shoulder, Senenmut, who I think was the historical Moses, which we've talked about before. Egypt mapped the region thoroughly in the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty. Included in these maps were all the main roads of Palestine. Among them, an important fixed route through Transjordan that linked the Arabah and the plains of Moab. And this road was in continuous use throughout the late Bronze Age. So during this entire period, its course remained constant. It was scrupulously maintained by Egypt, not merely for access to its Transjordanian principalities, but also for access to Palestine, Canaan, Cisjordan, from the east. Now, don't confuse this road with the so-called King's Highway. That went through Transjordan. It's also mentioned in the Bible. That was a different road altogether. Transjordan is also mentioned in the Bible, by the way. So the King's Highway was the great north-south road from Syria to northern Arabia. The Arabah to the plains of Moab road, on the other hand, was this relatively short route that served a specific function at the time, to get the traveler from the region immediately south of the Dead Sea to the Jordan River across from Jericho. I think it's very interesting that the Israelites during the Exodus used established highways, if you will. We're talking about 3,000-year-old highways. And you can still go see the remnants of these roads. Some of them have highways, major highways, built on top of them. It's like if you go to England today, I know it's much more modern, so to speak, but when I was digging into the Robin Hood legends, they always talked about the King's Highway in England that went up from London in through Nottingham and Sherwood and up into the forests of Barnesdale and the towns of Barnesdale and Leeds. That these were places where the Robin Hood legend took place, Barnesdale and Leeds. That old King's Highway today, I think, is the A1, the major freeway that if that's it, if it's the M1 or the A1 that goes north of London and up through all those areas. Same thing in ancient Egypt and ancient Palestine. So these ancient Egyptian maps have survived, but not as hand-drawn maps, but as lists, in list form. And each list contains the names of the cities along the road, transcribed from original map in precise sequence. And these were then combined with numerous similar maps into longer topographical lists, inscribed on the walls of ancient Egyptian temples, which I think makes this very cool. 3 such maps of the road from the Arabah to the plains of Moab road have come down to us. None of them's complete. That is, none contains all the stations along the road, but the individual maps complement each other. When the stations that they list are collated, we get a fairly complete picture of the road all the way from the southern end of the Dead Sea to the Jordan River. And the earliest of the 3 maps comes from the reign of Tutmosis III. And that's in 1504 to 1450, thereabouts, depending on which chronology of the kings you look at. Now, if you remember, Tutmosis III, in my theory that Senenmut was Moses, Tutmosis III was the stepson to Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of Egypt, whose husband, Tutmosis II, died fairly early, late 20s. She took over while his son from a harem wife was Tutmosis III. He was only 3 years old when his dad died. He couldn't be pharaoh at age 3, so the queen takes over, Hatshepsut. She is also, her husband was her brother, the way they did those things back then. She claimed she had more right to the throne than anybody else at that time. So she became co-regent for 6 years with the child pharaoh, Tutmosis III. And then she sent him off to Memphis, north and he became the general of all the armies of Egypt as he grew older. But there was never a coup. It wasn't until she died, when he was almost 30 years old himself, that he finally took his rightful place as pharaoh. So it was this guy, Tutmosis III, who in the mid-1400s, he created or inscribed on the Temple of Ammon at Karnak as part of the so-called Palestine list. This is the greatest of the Egyptian topographical lists, containing 119 place names that are associated with numerous routes in Palestine, in Transjordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, and the route of the Arabah and the plains of Moab names in order to form from north south to north 4 stations. This whole Ian, Diban, Abel, Jordan connection. And it's not difficult to recognize this route in Numbers 33. Here's how it's stated according to the Tutmosis III list. And by the way, let me just say, I've been to this temple at Karnak in Egypt. I've been to the sacred lake of Tutmosis III. It's larger than an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Sits out in front of his temple at the temple complex of Karnak. And I've seen these inscriptions on the walls of his temple, that the Temple of Ammon. And so the names are, on Tutmosis III's list, Ian, or Ian, it's all these I sounds together. I-Y-Y-I-N. Ian, and Diban, Abel, and Jordan. He lists those 4 cities. In Numbers 33, the cities listed are Ian, Diban, Almon Dibathaim, Nebo, Abel, Shittim, and Jordan. So they all cross over. There's a few extra cities listed in Numbers. Tutmosis IV names 4 of them. 2 other late Bronze Age Egyptian maps neatly complement Tutmosis III's map. The Tutmosis map dates to the late Bronze Age, which is, early 1400s BC. And the other 2 date to the late Bronze Age A, 2A. If you want to get technical archaeological terms, 1400 to 1300 BCE. And the late Bronze Age 2B, which is 1300 to 1200 BCE. So thus, the road is documented throughout the whole entire late Bronze Age. And the older of the other 2 maps dates to the reign of Amenephis III, or Amenhotep III. Amenephis III. And it's inscribed in his mortuary temple at Suleb. And it contains 3 stations listed in the north-south direction. That Akorbat, Haraseth, and Melach. And the latter means salt and refers to the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. And the youngest of the 3 extant maps of this road dates to the reign of Ramses II, which he reigned from 1279 to 1212 BCE. So you can see, if I place the Exodus in 1445, then the 40 years wandering, and then the conquest of Jericho and Canaan starting in about 405 BCE, you can see how the 200-year difference there fits in. And it's part of the topographical list inscribed on the west side of the entrance to the Great Hall of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak. And it lists 4 stations on Ramses II's list. It's just a map of the region. And he's got Herez, he's got Quaro or Diban, he's got Iktanu and Abel. And again, in Numbers, we have Ayam, Diban, Almon, Diabathim, Nebo, Abel, Shittim, and Jordan. And so it's filling in all the gaps, is what it's starting to do. Now, Quaro, Q-A-R-H-O, is another name of Diban. And in the famous Misha stele, or the Moabite stone, the 9th century Moabite king Misha regularly calls Diban Quarho, or Q-A-R-H-O. And in this inscription, Mesa uses the name Diban exclusively for his political state. But Diban and Quaro seem to have been used interchangeably as names for the same city. Although Ramses II calls the city Quarho, he calls it Diban in an historical inscription, which we're going to we might get to tonight. And so in 2 of the 3 inscriptions, we have irrefutable primary historical evidence for the existence of the city of Diban in the late Bronze Age. Now, this all sounds, it all be like way out there for all of you. So what? You say, I'm never going to use that knowledge. What's interesting about it is that this historical information from map listings in Egypt, ancient Egypt, 3 of them converge to create the same list that you find in Numbers 33 of the stations along the route that the Israelites took post-Exodus to get into Canaan. And so in addition to a number of ancient sites names that have survived in their modern names, biblical Ayim, Egyptian Ayin, survive in the middle village of Ai, A-Y. And biblical and Egyptian Dibon survives as Dibon with an H in the middle of it. Iktanu is the present-day ruin called Tel Iktanu. And when the 3 Egyptian lists are combined, you acquire a nearly complete roadmap substantiated by Egyptian history that coincides with the writings of Moses about the route they took, which is very, and I'm not going to name all the cities again. So in short, the biblical story of the invasion of Transjordan east of the Jordan River. So if you look at a map of Israel, you've got, I'm going to do it backwards here, so you're looking at me. You've got the Mediterranean Sea on the west. You've got Israel. You've got the Jordan River, which you've got the Sea of Galilee at the top, and the Dead Sea at the bottom. And then you have a short strip of land there, and the Jordan River, and then Jordan is on the east side, all coming up from Egypt in the south. So the biblical story of the invasion of Transjordan that set the stage for the conquest of all of Canaan, Palestine, is told against a background that is absolutely historically accurate. Now, whether God was there and parted the waters of the Red Sea, whether God was there and led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, that's the spiritual stuff that's wrapped around the actual historical event. So the Israelite invasion route that's described in Numbers, the book of Numbers 33 in the Old Testament, was in fact an official, heavily trafficked Egyptian road through the Transjordan in the late Bronze Age. So in a sense, here's these Israelite slaves who all escaped Egypt, if you will. They exited out of Egypt, and they wandered as nomadic tribe for 40 years in the Sinai area. And when they finally went up into Canaan, they just hopped back on the Egyptian highway, took the highway to get there. So it's an official, heavily trafficked Egyptian road through the Transjordan in the late Bronze Age. And the city of Dibon was in fact a station on that road in the late Bronze Age. Nor was Dibon silent in its ruins. Ramses II tells us that he sacked the city in the course of a military campaign in Moab, leaving us with no doubt that Dibon was there at the time. It was occupied. It was worth sacking. This is 150 years after what I believe was the date of the Exodus. You've got Ramses going in and sacking the city. And so, to date, archaeologists may not have found its ruins, but it surely existed. Now, let me add a little note on something here, and that is the city of Jericho. We've talked about this before, but you remember the old Negro spiritual, as they used to call them, which is probably downright politically incorrect to say now. But that's how they were referred, Negro spirituals, of Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. You remember the whole story of the city of Jericho, that the Israelites marched around the city 7 times in accordance to what God told them to do, and God broke down the walls of the city. Now you can go to the ruins called Tel Sultan in the city of Jericho today, where they've been doing archaeological work for over 100 years, and you can find that that city was indeed sacked. There are many places on the walls where you found the walls fell out from the city and were crumbled from the outside. Now it had been rebuilt but it was rebuilt a long time after the conquest of Joshua and the Israelites. Now, what's very interesting is that you find that according to historical records at Tel Sultan, they say that this decimation of the city, whatever it was, took place around 1405 BCE. That's the date they place it. 1405 BCE. Now, and that the city itself of Jericho was unoccupied for another 800 years. It was almost 600 years after the death of Ramses II before Jericho was even occupied again. And then the new city grew up around the Tel, and that's what you have today when you go to the current city of Jericho in Jordan. Now, what's interesting about this is if that decimation, what they have found in the ruins at Tel Sultan of Jericho, they've dated it to 1405 BCE. What's interesting is that if Joshua, indeed, as the biblical account says, was in charge of the army that destroyed that city, and if that took place in 1405 BC is when that city was destroyed, according to archaeology, if that took place according to the biblical account 40 years after the Exodus, you would have the Exodus, of course, right around 1445 to 1450 BCE, which fits the dates of my guy. All the pharaohs that I've talked about ad infinitum in my own book, and in several times we talked about this. But Ramesses being the pharaoh of the Exodus, if Jericho was destroyed in 1405 and not occupied again until almost the late 500s, early 400s BCE, and Ramses II lived in 1200 BCE, 150 years after the destruction of Jericho, then that simple fact alone tells you that Ramesses II could not have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. Because if they sacked Jericho 40 years after the Exodus, let's even say they're fudging with the dates. Let's say it was a week after the Exodus, and they sacked it in around 1405 BC. Ramses wasn't born for another 150 years. So if that took place post-Exodus, there you go. So let's leave that at that, without getting into proving that it was the Israelites who did it. And we got about 3-4 minutes left of the show, but there's a final note on the city of Abel. When Joseph took his embalmed father, Jacob, from Egypt to Hebron in order to bury him in the cave of Machpelah, the funeral procession stopped at a Transjordanian site identified as Abel Mitzrayim. And Abel of the Egyptians is what that means. That's in Genesis 50. And at that time, as we now know from our Egyptian sources, the city was still under Egyptian administration, or its Egyptian past was still warm in the memory of the biblical historian of those he consulted. This was most likely the late Bronze Age. And we've talked about Joseph. Maybe we'll do it again sometime in a little more detail. But Joseph, he's the one that invited his brothers to come from Canaan and settle in the land of Goshen. And it was their descendants a couple of hundred years later, of course, that became the slaves in Egypt, the Israelite slaves. Now, I want to skip over to something here. I want to show you a couple of maps. Let me show you this one. Let's look at the Delta. Okay, now you see this? This is a Google Earth map I just pulled down today of Egypt. Now, you can see, I don't have any markings on this, but you can see the green patch in the top, just left of the central area. That's the Nile Delta. And the blue area up above is the Mediterranean Sea. And the blue area to the right at the bottom is the Red Sea, with the Gulf of Aqaba branching off to the north on the right, and I can't remember what the Gulf is called there, but it's an extension of the Red Sea going up on the left. And if you look just above that, there are some lakes that are up in there. Those are called the Bitter Lakes or the Reed Sea. And there's a little white line you can almost make out going straight north and south above that. That's the Suez Canal today. Now you see the Nile River snaking down. You see all the vegetation that grows off the river. The river on this map is just a little thin sliver in the middle of all that greenery going down the map. And where it loops out at the bottom, center of the map, that's Luxor, is situated right there. Now let me call up this other map, and I'm going to come in a little tighter on this. Boom. Now here, let me show you something. Right where the Nile River meets in the north, the base of the Nile Triangle Delta there, that's this region now. We're zooming in. Boom. That's where the Nile starts to meet the delta. Today is the modern city of Cairo. It's right there. And if you go down a little to the southwest, you're going to see the Giza Plateau out in the desert area there, and the pyramids and the Sphinx and so on. Now, Memphis, however, was the city, and it's about 25 to 30 miles south of Cairo. Memphis was the northern capital of Egypt. And if you look over, it says the Israelites dwelt in the land of Goshen, which was Pi-Ramses. When Ramses II rebuilt it, it was originally the city of Avaris. And you can see in the delta where Goshen is. Now, it says that when the Israelites left Egypt, that they came to the Red Sea. It's a mistranslation. It was the Sea of Reeds, the Bitter Lakes. You see where I have the words in white there, the Wadi Tumalat. A wadi is a wash. It's a place that fills with water once a year. And you see there's an arc of green above that. That greenery is because that area gets the wash of water into it. Now, the Wadi Tumalat was also a trade route. And so you follow that trade route, it goes almost to the base of Goshen, the place where the Israelites dwelt. They left Egypt, they traversed the Wadi Tumalat, and they came out at the northern tip of the Sea of Reeds. And I believe that's the body of water they crossed. And I've given all kinds of geological data on some of the things that would happen. The wind blowing in off, you see where off to the left of this map, the right of the map, you see that goes up into the Negev in Israel. The winds would come off. And down below, you see the big expanse of the northern branch of the Red Sea. And then the Sinai Peninsula, of course. So this is the route I believe the Egyptians, or the Israelites took. They left Pi-Ramses or Goshen from Egypt, and they followed the trade route, the Wadi Tumalat, across to the Sea of Reeds. And they crossed over and they went south. And right near the northern tip of the Red Sea there is a place called, not Gebel Musa, that means the mountain of Moses, but the word for spring, and I can't remember, it's something Musa. It's the well of Moses. And it sits right there in the deserted area, just off the shore to the west northern tip of the Red Sea. And you follow that path down and then cut over into the middle of the Sinai, and you have Serebet el Khidim, which I believe was the, of course, the site of Mount Sinai. So there you go, folks. We're out of time. I'm way over time. So I got to stop. We may pick some of this up later and hit some really fun details with this. There's your history lesson to go into the weekend with. Remember, Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, right here for It's Sunday. We'll see you then. Have a good night.